Seen in the sad glamour of an English twilight, the old moat house, emerging from the thin mists which veiled the green flats in which it stood, conveyed the impression of a habitation falling into senility, tired with centuries of existence. Houses grow old like the race of men. The process is not less inevitable, though slower. In both, decay is hastened by events as well as by the passage of time. The moat house was not so old as English country houses go, but it had aged quickly because of its past. There was a weird and bloody history attached to the place, an historical record of murders and stabbings and quarrels dating back to Saxon days, when a castle had stood on the spot, and every inch of the flat land had been drenched in the blood of serfs fighting under a Saxon tyrant against a Norman tyrant for the sacred catchword of liberty. The victorious Norman tyrant had killed the Saxon, taken his castle, and tyrannized over the serfs during his little day, until the greater tyrant, death, had taught him his first and last lesson of humility. After his death, some fresh usurper had pulled down his stolen castle, and built a moat house on the site. During the next few hundred years there had been more fighting for restless ambition, invariably connected with the making and unmaking of tyrants, until an English king lost his head in the cause of liberty, and the moat house was destroyed by fire for the same glorious principle. It was rebuilt by the freebooter who had burnt it down, one Philip Herodotus, a descendant of Philip Herodotus, whose name is inscribed in the Doomsday Book as one of the knights of the army of Duke William which had assembled at Dives for the conquest of England. Philip Herodotus, who was as great a fighter as his Norman ancestor, established his claim to his new estate, and avoided litigation concerning it, by confining the royalist owner and his family within the walls of the moat house before setting it on fire. He afterwards married and settled down in the new house with his young wife. But the honeymoon was disturbed by the ghost of the cavalier he had incinerated, who warned him that as he had founded his line in horror it would end in horror, and the house he had built would fall to the ground. Philip Herodotus, like many other great fighters, was an exceedingly pious man, with a profound belief in the efficacy of prayer. He endeavored to thwart the ghost's curse by building a church in the moat house grounds, where he spent his Sundays praying for the eternal welfare of the gentleman he had cut off in the flower of his manhood. Perhaps the prayers were heard, for, when Philip Herodotus in the course of time became the first occupant of the brand new vault he had built for himself and his successors, he left behind him much wealth, and a catalogue of his virtues in his own handwriting. The wealth he left to his heirs, but he expressly stipulated that the record of his virtues was to be carved in stone and placed as an enduring tablet, for the edification of future generations, inside the church he had built. It was a wise precaution on his part. The dead are dumb as to their own merits, and the living think only of themselves. Time sped away, until the first of the Herodotus was forgotten as completely as though he had never existed. Even his dust had been crowded off the shelf of his own vault to make room for the numerous descendants of the prolific and prosperous line he had founded. But the tablet remained, and the old moat house he had built still stood. It was a wonderful old place and a delight to the eye, this medieval moat house of mellow brick, stone facings, high-pitched roof, with terraced gardens and encircling moat. It had defied time better than its builder, albeit a little shakily, with signs of decrepitude here and there apparent in the crow's-feet cracks of the brickwork, and decay only too plainly visible in the crazy angles of the tiled roof. But the ivy which covered portions of the brickwork hid some of the ravages of age, and helped the moat house to show a brave front to the world, a well-preserved survivor of an ornamental period in a commonplace and ugly generation. The place looked as though it belonged to the past and the ghosts of the past. To cross the moat bridge was to step backward from the 20th century into the 17th. The moss-grown moat walls enclosed an old-world garden, most jealously guarded by high yew hedges trimmed into fantastic shapes of birds and animals, a garden of parterres and lawns, where tritons blew stone horns, and naked nymphs bathed in marble fountains, with an ancient sundial on which the gay scapegrace suckling had once scribbled a sonnet to a pair of blue eyes, a garden full of sequestered walks and hidden nooks where courtly cavaliers and bewitching dames in brocades and silks, patches, and powder had played at the great game of love in their day. That day was long since dead. The tritons and nymphs remained, to remind humanity that stone and marble are more durable than flesh and blood, but the lords and ladies had gone, never to return, unless, indeed, their spirits walked the garden in the white stillness of moonlit nights. They may well have done so. It was easy to imagine such light-hearted beauties visiting again the old garden to revive dead memories of love and laughter, shadowy forms stealing forth to assignations on the blanched, dew-laden lawn, their roguish faces and bright eyes, if ghosts have eyes, peeping out of ghostly hoods at gay ghostly cavaliers, coquetting and languishing behind ghostly fans, perhaps even feeding, with ghostly little hands, the peacocks which still kept the terrace walk above the moat. The spectacle of a group of modern ladies laughing and chatting at tea in the cloistered recesses of the terrace garden struck a note as sharply incongruous as a flock of parrots chattering in a cathedral. It was the autumn of 1918, and with one exception the ladies seated at the tea tables on the lawn represented the new and independent type of womanhood called into existence by the national exigencies of war. The elder of them looked useful rather than beautiful, as befitted patriotic English women in wartime. The younger ones were pretty and charming, but they were all workers, or pretended workers, in the task of helping England win the war, and several of them wore the khaki or blue of active service abroad. They were all very much at ease, laughing and talking as they drank their tea and threw cake to the peacocks perched on the high terrace walk above their heads. The ladies were the guests of Sir Philip Herodotus. Some months before, his only son Philip, then holding a post in the War Office, had fallen in love with the pretty face of a girl employed in one of the departments of Whitehall. He married her soon afterwards, and brought her home to the moat house. It was the young husband who had suggested that they should liven up the old moat house by inviting some of their former London friends down to stay with them. Violet Herodotus, who found herself bored with country life after the excitement of London war work, caught eagerly at the idea, and the majority of the ladies at tea were the former Whitehall acquaintances of the young wife, with whom she had shared matinee tickets and afternoon teas in London during the last winter of the war. The hostess of the party, Miss Alethea Herodotus, sister of the present baronet, Sir Philip Herodotus, and mistress of the moat house since the death of Lady Herodotus, belonged to a bygone and almost extinct type of Englishwoman, the provincial great lady, local society leader, village patroness, sportswoman, and churchwoman in one, a type exclusively English, taking several centuries to produce in its finished form. Miss Herodotus was an excellent, if somewhat terrific, specimen of the class. She was tall and massive, with a large boned face, tan red with country air, shrewd grey eyes looking out beneath thick eyebrows which met across her forehead in a straight line, the Herodotus eyebrows, and a strong, hooked nose, the Herodotus falcon nose. But in spite of her massive frame, red face, hooked nose, and countrified attire, she looked more in place with the surroundings than the frilier and paler specimens of womanhood to whom she was dispensing tea. There was a stiff and stately grace in her movements, a slow ceremoniousness in her politeness to her guests, which seemed to harmonize with the 17th-century setting of the moat-house garden. At the moment the ladies were discussing an event which had been arranged for that night, a country drive, to be followed by a musical evening and dance. The invitations had been issued by the Waynes, a young couple who had recently made their home in the county. The husband was a popular novelist, who had left the distractions of London in order to win fame and peace and quietness in the country. Mrs. Wayne, who had been slightly acquainted with Mrs. Herodotus before her marriage, was delighted to learn she was to have her for a neighbor. She had arranged the evening on her behalf, and had asked Miss Herodotus to bring all her guests. The event was to mark the close of the house party, which was to break up on the following day. Unfortunately, Mrs. Herodotus had fallen ill a few hours previously, and it was doubtful whether she would be able to join in the festivity. "I hope you will all remember that dinner is to be a quarter of an hour earlier tonight," said Miss Herodotus, as she handed a cup of tea to one of her guests. "It is a long drive to the Waynes' place, so I shall order the cars for 7:30. The guests glanced at their hostess and murmured polite assent. "I am looking forward to the visit so much," said the lady to whom Miss Herodotus had handed the cup. "It will be so romantic, a country dance in a lonely house on a hill. What an adorable cup, dear Miss Herodotus. I love Chinese eggshell porcelain, but this is simply beyond anything. It's..." Whatever induced Dolly Wayne to bury herself in the country? Abruptly exclaimed a young woman with cropped hair and khaki uniform. She loathed the country before she was married. Mrs. Wayne is a wife, and it is her duty to like her husband's home, said Miss Herodotus a little primly. She disapproved of the speaker, whose khaki uniform, close-cropped hair, crossed legs, and arms akimbo struck her as everything that was modern and unwomanly. Then what induced Teddy Wayne to bury himself alive in the wilds? I'm sure it must be terrible living up there alone, with nothing but earwigs and owls for company. Mr. Wayne is a writer, rejoined Miss Herodotus. He needs seclusion. My husband doesn't, said a little fair-haired woman. He says newspaper men can write anywhere. And we know another writer, a Mr. Harland, I think his name is, who writes long articles in the Sunday newspapers. I don't think his name is Harland, dear, interrupted another lady. Something like it, but not Harland. Dear me, what is it? Oh, the name doesn't matter, retorted her friend. The point is that he writes long articles in his London office. Why can't Mr. Wayne do the same? Mr. Wayne is a novelist, not a journalist. It's quite a different thing. Is it? Responded the other doubtfully. All writing is the same, isn't it? Harry says Mr. Harland's articles are dreadfully clever. He sometimes reads bits of them to me. Mrs. Wayne feels a little lonely sometimes, said Miss Herodotus. She has been looking forward to meeting Violet again. It will be pleasant for both of them to renew their acquaintance. I should think she and Violet would get on well together, remarked the young lady with the short hair. They both have a good many tastes in common. Neither likes the country, for one thing. The other ladies looked at one another, and the speaker, realizing that she had been tactless, stopped abruptly. How is Violet? She added lamely. Do you think she will be well enough to go tonight? I still hope she may be well enough to go, replied Miss Herodotus. I will ask her presently. Will anyone have another cup of tea? Nobody wanted any more tea. The meal was finished, but the groups of ladies at the little tables sat placidly talking, enjoying the peaceful surroundings and the afternoon sun. Some of the girls produced cigarette cases and lit cigarettes. There was a sound of footsteps on the gravel walk. A tall, good-looking young officer was seen walking across the garden from the house. As he neared the tea tables, he smilingly raised a finger to his forehead in salute. I've come to say goodbye, he announced. The ladies clustered around him. It was evident from their manner that he was a popular figure among them. Several of the younger girls addressed him as Dick, and asked him to send them trophies from the front. The young officer held his own amongst them with laughing self-possession. When he had taken his farewell of them, he approached Miss Herodotus, and held out his hand with a deferential politeness which contrasted rather noticeably with the easy familiarity of his previous leave-taking. I am sorry you are compelled to leave us, Captain Nepcote, said Miss Herodotus, rising with dignity to accept his outstretched hand. Do you return immediately to the front? Tonight, I expect. I trust you will return safely to your native land before long, crowned with victory and glory. Captain Nepcote bowed in some embarrassment. Like the rest of his generation, he was easily discomposed by fine words or any display of the finer feelings. He was about 28, of medium height, clean-shaven, with clear-cut features, brown hair, and blue eyes. At the first glance he conveyed nothing more than an impression of a handsome young English officer of the familiar type turned out in thousands during the war, but as he stood there talking, a sudden ray of sunlight falling on his bared head revealed vague lines in the face and a suspicion of silver in the closely cropped hair, suggesting something not altogether in keeping with his debonair appearance, secret trouble or dissipation. It was impossible to say which. "Will you say goodbye to Mrs. Herodotus for me?" he said, after a slight pause. "I hope she will soon be better. I have said goodbye to Sir Philip and Phil. Sir Philip wanted to drive me to the station, but I know something of the difficulties of getting petrol just now, and I wouldn't allow him. Awfully kind of him. Phil suggested walking down with me, but I thought it would be too much for him." They had walked away from the tea tables towards the bridge which spanned the entrance to the moat house. Miss Herodotus paused by two brass cannon, which stood on the lawn in a clump of ornamental foliage, with an inscription stating that they had been taken from the Passat Berthoud, a French vessel captured by Admiral Herodotus in the Indian Seas in 1804. "It is hard for Phil, a Herodotus, to remain behind when all young Englishmen are fighting for their beloved land," she said softly, her eyes fixed upon these obsolete pieces of ordnance. "He comes of a line of great warriors. However," she went on, in a more resolute tone, "Phil has his duties to fulfill, in spite of his infirmity. We all have our duties, thank God. Goodbye, Captain Nepcote. I am keeping you, and you may miss your train. Goodbye, Miss Herodotus. Thank you so much for your kindness during a very pleasant visit. I've enjoyed myself awfully. I am glad that you have enjoyed your stay. I hope you will come and see us again when your military duties permit." Yes. Thank you awfully. Thank you once more for your kindness." The young officer uttered these polite platitudes of a guest's farewell with some abruptness, bowed once more, and turned away across the old stone bridge which spanned the moat,